Welcome to all. I'm Al Cook, the coordinator of the Humanitarian Assistance and Disaster Relief Programme and Senior Fellow at RSIS. I'll be the moderator for today's webinar on Is Malaysia Ready for its Next Major Flood? History, Politics and Policy Challenges in Flood Governance. As we enter the northeast monsoon season, it's predicted that we're going to see 4 to 6 episodes of heavy rain that will occur in Malaysia from around now until March 2024. In preparation for this, Malaysia's built around 8,000 relief centres to offer temporary accommodation for about 2.1 million people. As noted in the webinar abstract, the timing of Malaysia's 15th general election back in November 2022 during the annual northeast monsoon season was controversial, particularly given Malaysians' recent memory of their worst flood in decades back in December 2021. Despite the loss of life and people displaced, climate change and disaster management received little attention during the general election. In the past, Malaysia has experienced severe flooding, such as the Great Flood in 1926, which proved to be a catalyst for an improvement in land and river management. But more recently, the major floods of 2014 and 2021 undermined public confidence. So this webinar brings together a panel of 3 experts to analyse the historical and contemporary government and societal responses to extreme weather events in Malaysia and what they tell us about Malaysia's environmental and political landscape today. Now, let me briefly introduce our 3 speakers. Our first speaker is Associate Professor Fiona Williamson, who is an environmental historian at the College of Integrative Studies at Singapore Management University. Our second speaker is Mr. Said Alhudzari, who is Country Programme Manager in the Malaysia office of the Qatar charity. He has wide experience in the humanitarian and development sectors, notably in his various roles at Mercy Malaysia. Our final speaker is Professor Kian-Ming, who serves as Programme Director of Philosophy, Politics and Economics at Taylor's University in Malaysia and Director of the Digital Economy and Business Transformation Impact Lab. He's also Senior Advisor to Global Council, an international advisory firm, and a member of the Board of Directors of the Malaysian Investment Development Authority. He's also a former 2-term Member of Parliament in Malaysia from 2013 to 2022, representing the Democratic Action Party, and was the Deputy Minister of International Trade and Industry. Each speaker will present for 10 to 15 minutes. They'll be notified after about 10 minutes that they have 5 minutes remaining, and I will ask each of them to wrap up by the end of 15 minutes. Once our speakers have shared their views, I'll offer some reflection and then ask Ariel Tan, coordinator of the Malaysia Programme and Senior Fellow, to respond and ask questions. We'll then proceed to Q&A with participants. Please use the Q&A function on this platform to ask your questions. And please kindly note that this is a public webinar and it will be recorded and posted on the RSIS website. Now, without further ado, may I invite Fiona to please take the floor.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction, Alistair. I'm just going to share my slides, so bear with me whilst I do this. Okay, can I just check that you can see my slides okay?
Yes.
Yeah, fantastic. All right, well, as Alistair so rightly pointed out, I'm an environmental historian. So in which case, my job is to look at floods in the past, and to look at their impacts on society, and also to consider to what extent we can perhaps learn lessons from how these were managed. And I want to look at a period of especially severe flooding over what was then British Malaya in the early 20th century. It uses a range of archival contemporary reports to understand the complex and underlying reasons why flooding occurred in some places repeatedly and severely. Although contemporary government, the contemporary administrators were aware of these problem areas, and in many cases, they put in flood mitigation works to prevent future episodes. But what we find when we look over this long period is that flooding was not always alleviated as had been hoped, and that floods continue to affect some of the same areas with regularity, even right up until the present day. So this, to me, as a historian, raises many important questions. And whilst it might be too much of a cliche to ask why we never learn from the past, the advantage of historic case studies derives not only from the long view, but the ability to remove our investigation from potential political sensitivities. And the striking similarity of flood triggers over such long periods of time might also suggest that our past experiences could provide inspiration for finding resolutions to these combined natural, infrastructural, and potentially political problems. So the 1920s is the period that I really want to look at because these were years of very serious and frequent flooding across all of Malaysia and in Singapore, especially in the middle of the decade, around 1925, 1926, and these affected both rural and urban areas. In 1926, what was then known as the Great Flood actually entailed a series of severe inundations that affected KL, and a proportion of the rural peninsula north of KL, including Selangor, Perak, and some of the worst hit areas on the more rural areas such as Kelantan and Pahang. At a plantation estate in Kelantan, for example, contemporary records tell us that the floodwaters held such strength that, and I quote, jungle trees were brought down, stripped of all branches and bark, leaving bare trunks. The remains of human beings consisted of skeletons only, all flesh having been stripped off by abrasion. Buildings and machinery were left coated in slime, and the dead bodies of tigers, bear, deer, and pigs were deposited across the estate. A private railway linking the plantation to mines was partially washed away, and the trains had to be dug out of the mud afterwards. Just north of Kuala Lumpur, in the mining town of Kuala Kubu, the district officer reported how there'd been continuous rain for at least 5 days from the 25th of December. And Kuala Kubu got cut off from by both road and rail, and one young boy had died there. Access roads to the hill areas, including Fraser's Hill, which was a popular tourist destination even then, had become impassable due to landslips and fallen trees. And there were at least 30 slips on the road leading out of Fraser's Hill. Contemporary photographs not only document the urban scenes, but also some of the rural scenes as well. These are from Perak, and the photographs were taken after the Perak River had risen apparently more than 25 feet above its normal level. Also at Pahang, the railway track running into Kelantan was flooded under depths of 20 feet, with the force of the waters sweeping away steel bridges over the river. And in Pahang, the British resident wrote a letter actually pleading for help from the government then based in Singapore, claiming that the flood height had exceeded the previous record set in 1924 by at least 5 feet. And he described the enormous losses caused by the disaster, especially to the agricultural Malay population, who were suffering great hardship because they'd had their houses, their cattle, and everything that they owned washed away. And he asked that a relief ship of rice could be sent up along the peninsula, because this was the easiest way to reach them at this time, so that the rice could reach the agricultural population so that they didn't starve. And he actually had to send this by letter because all the telegraphic communications were down, but he wasn't entirely sure that the letter would even reach Singapore. So this is just a very brief description of how bad these floods were. But what I want to do is actually have a little bit of a look at what caused the scale of some of these disasters. I mean, obviously, there was extremely heavy and prolonged and exceptional rain. The peak of flood events around this period was actually linked to the ENSO oscillation. It was a particularly severe La Nina episode. With this severe La Nina event around 1925 to the end of 1926. So there were exceptional rains, but then this is not the whole picture. You know, exceptional rains happen in the tropics quite a lot, especially with the periodic ENSO. So what else was going on in the background? Well, ironically, in the early part of November, just before these floods had happened over Christmas, the poor situation as regard flood control had actually been discussed at meetings for the municipal sanitary boards in places like Kuala Lumpur and Singapore, because this is part of an ongoing discussion at government levels about the seeming worsening of severe flood events across the 1910s and into the 1920s. There'd been a major flood event in 1911, for example, which had inspired the government to take some action and some precautionary measures. But just before this major flood happened in 1926, committee members of the Sanitary Board are actually asking government, well, what's happened to some of those improvements that were cited to have been brought in after 1911? One of the big plans, for example, had been to undertake works on the Klang River by making cuts to divert the floodwaters. But one of the members, Koo Keng Hoi, noted that the state engineer had mysteriously stopped providing quarterly progress reports some years earlier, and nobody really knew what was going on. And Koo argued that nobody said anything about this because, just with luck, there'd been no major flood events since then, so therefore everything had just kind of been brushed under the carpet. Another member, Mr. Yap Tai Chi, added that the former executive engineer had declared in 1923 that the improvement measures so far were good enough, and that there would be no more floods in Kuala Lumpur ever again. So this is in 1923. And of course, I'm sure in 1926, his fellows in government were to bring that comment again back at him. It was certainly an ill-fated comment. Now, the executive engineer responded also saying, so far as he knew, the cuts had been made and maintained, but other members disagreed, saying that actually the work that had been undertaken wasn't fit for purpose. And one of the issues is that the last flood had actually reached a higher level than any previous known record. So if you're basing your flood mitigation on previous record heights, and then those floods get worse, then of course you never actually manage to deal with the problem. And so in 1926, when there was this severe La Nina, which produced water maybe 5 foot more than previous floods, then this of course was a problem too. So another irony is that the flood mitigation work that had been carried out by the government had actually magnified the problem in some areas, partly because it wasn't being carried out properly. By way of example, a few months prior to the Great Flood, state engineers had enacted a relief plan for the Selangor River. And actually, after the flood, the acting state engineer confessed that the plan of making these particular cuts and the partial clearing of jungle along the banks of the river, what actually happened is that they'd just pushed the floods further than they would normally go, because diverting the water had actually flooded areas of the country that wasn't normally flooded previously. So although directing water away from the river course was the intended effect, the system had been overwhelmed and actually channeled water into a far larger space. And a related problem was also the quality of the work being carried out. So in 1926, a state engineer had visited the work site to make a progress report, but was disappointed because he'd found that there'd been felled trees, they'd been left to block the river, earth removed during the process of deepening the river channel had been left on the banks. And then, of course, when you get the rain, it goes back straight into the river again and silts the river up. So a lot of these man-made prevention schemes and the poor quality of the work were actually making the situation a great deal worse. So in the early 1920s, the government had appointed C.E. Depuy, who was a leading British engineer, as an advisor on irrigation and flood prevention. And Depuy was critical of how human intervention had actually imbalanced the delicate ecosystem, thus exacerbating the impact of heavy rains. And in particular, he wanted to draw attention to the loss of the natural habitat, particularly around the riverine areas, which had caused more soil wash into the rivers, thus siltation, had caused soil erosion on some of the higher ground, and then caused erosion that then helped to silt and block the rivers as well. So removing a lot of the virgin jungle being replaced by quick-growing plants didn't perform the vital role that trees had previously done in protecting river banks and floodplains. And Penang Hill is a very good example of this. It's kind of a cascading effect. We've got records of floods occurring here from as early as 1847. It has a very steep rise and it's historically a very flood-prone area. But then badly designed engineering works, poorly regulated and maintained building in infrastructure, poor land management, poorly thought out development projects, in combination with deforestation and then the subsequent soil erosion that happened, it basically overwhelmed the system. And Penang Hill was, and I believe actually still is, a bit of a problem area for a very long time. So just my last couple of slides, I wanted to note that after 1926, the government did respond. The problem was considered so bad by this point that even the American government were talking about the problems in Malaya. I was surprised to find these records in the archives. And they appointed a commission to investigate the state of the Federated Malay States rivers. They established a Rivers Advisory Board, and they did lots of relief work on some of the rivers, including the Klang River as well. They proposed major works in the flood-prone Kinta Valley in Perak, where mining works had severely damaged the local environment. And they did extensive work over the next 10 years on the country's river system. And a significant development as well was also the appointment of a dedicated drainage and irrigation department in 1933, which took responsibility for flooding from the Public Works Department. So it actually meant that there was a dedicated department really looking into this a little bit more. A couple of other things that they did as well was they established a hill lands ordinance. This was specifically for the problems in Penang and some of the other mountainous areas as well. This is actually designed to target soil erosion and agricultural practices specifically that created more soil erosion, like clean weeding. So in summary, the 1926 Great Flood was essentially a catalyst in hydraulic governance in Malaysia at that time. It irrevocably changed the Malayan landscape, the river system, and also government policy at that time. Dredging to deepen river courses, river deviation, the building of bunds, and jungle clearances were key to the plans. But ironically, I would argue a lot of these things actually exacerbated the problems, especially clearing the forests near the rivers. But what did happen is a lot of these things were done with a more kind of a joined up solution in mind. So a lot of these schemes were initiated with sanitary improvements and other works, especially in urban areas as well, including the building of new roads and bridges. In Penang, Singapore and Malacca as well, works were undertaken to raise roads, build river walls and to invest in land reclamation. So this is actually a massive shift in changing the natural landscape of the peninsula. But of course, floods continued. And I think some of the problems for this, I've looked as far kind of into like the 1950s. And one of the issues seems to be that a lot of these works, although these plans were proposed, a lot of the works were piecemeal and haphazard. They kind of shored up problems rather than actually bringing in longer term solutions. And this was largely due to a lack of money and investment in the first place. A lot of these works were built as one-offs, rather than as part of like a huge an integrated plan, because they were one-off with a government loan just to focus on one issue, rather than seeing it as more of a holistic project. Some of the regulation was also problematic as well. So I think just to summarize, I think one of the things that is important in looking at some of these historical studies is the recognition that in dealing with flood management, how, dealing with in the anthropogenic age that we're now going through, and we don't really necessarily know what's going to be happening. The chances are is that rain is going to be increasing in intensity and in frequency. There's possible suggestions that the ENSO is going to change in its nature as well. So we can't necessarily plan for things that we knew in the past. We need to always keep kind of scaling up plans and looking at maybe some of these historical case studies to see where things went wrong, to think about where things might be improved and more joined up solutions in the future. So that's my very brief sharing on historical floods and policy.
Thanks very much, Fiona. I think you've raised a couple of important points which ring true for what we see today as well, as you pointed out there at the end. So there's a lot of crossover with what is happening in the current period. Can I please now turn to Said, if you could please take the floor.
Thank you. So let me just share my slide. All right, so I'll be sharing my insight based on my interactions with the communities, as well as my engagement with local authorities and government agencies during coordination at all phases of responses in the flood-affected areas over the years. So that's my perspective. So my most recent mission was to Baling in Kedah back in 2022. The points I'm sharing here are observations consistently witnessed during response effort. So they are like things that I have observed that is consistent, throughout the disaster response, which may be something that needed to be addressed. I'm offering my insight from an external perspective, some of which has been shared through various engagement with the government, fellow respondents, as well as academicians in Malaysia. So this is my scope of presentation. So I'll talk first on the impact of floods in Malaysia, just to give an overview, what it's like, and the ground realities, and then the response and coordination, how it's being done, as well as the recovery and preparedness aspect of it, because I think it's very important for us to understand what are the things that has been done before and after the floods event itself. So looking at the flood impact, of course, flood since 2008, based on the record that I managed to obtain, has caused like a huge displacement. So in any humanitarian crisis, displacement is something that you look into, because that's how you manage your planning. So the flood in Malaysia has caused huge displacement. I think the most obvious one was back in 2014. Over 256,000 were displaced in Kelantan, Pahang, Terengganu, and part of Johor. And then the one in 2021, Selangor, and then it was Pahang, was badly affected. However, although the numbers in certain years are high and considered unprecedented, the reality is that most of the time, those affected or displaced can return to their home during or post-flood. So one reason communities decide to stay at temporary relief centers is because so that their names is part of the aid recipients. And then, of course, certainly some have been displaced longer due to the loss of properties. But this is not mainly due to the flood itself. It's due to they call it as the debris flow, which caused the destruction of houses. But this is, I mean, it only happened back in 2014 and 21. I think in other years, most of the flood evacuees are able to go back to their homes. Maybe a few houses is destroyed in like besides in 2014 and 2021, but it's very rarely happen. So the repair of impacted houses will take a minimum of 3 months. This is based on the timeline given by the government, with some taking more than a year. So when we responded to the flood situation in Kelantan back in 2014, 15, and then we returned back to the same area 2 years later, and then we were informed that the last families, just move into the permanent housing that, or permanent house that was built by the government. So yeah, I mean, I think it depends a lot on the intensity as well, and then the number of affected communities. So looking into the immediate impact of the flood, so there is a notable difference in how rural and urban communities react. Those in rural areas are more proactive, promptly leaving their homes upon receiving instructions from the authorities, likely due to the past experience of facing such issues. So conversely, urban areas, as seen in Selangor in 2021, displayed hesitancy to evacuate, perceiving that it is just a flash flood. So there is that wait and see attitude. So, for example, despite warning sirens in the flood-prone areas in Batu Muda, so Batu Muda is a flood-prone area, even when after it was developed. So there is a warning sirens installed there. So, but the communities ignored the sirens and decided to stay until the water level has reached to a danger level whereby they cannot really evacuate on their own. So during the flood, community rescuers and NGOs attempted to aid evacuations as government mobilized assets were insufficient to move the large populations. However, this assistance was voluntary. Those who failed to evacuate had to seek refuge in the nearest safe areas like mosques or community halls, leading to the creation of unofficial temporary relief centers. So this is an important point because I think, I mean, as we go through my presentation after this, we can see how the non-gazetted, the unofficial temporary evacuation centers has really affected how the response has been done in Malaysia. So the provision of essential items and relief items, stockpiles are exclusively planned for the gazetted temporary relief centers, the 8,000 that Dr. Alistair mentioned earlier. So there is like stockpiles of relief items being prepared for those gazetted temporary relief centers. But they are none, prepared for the non-gazetted TRCs. Of course, this is related to, in terms of to resources and all. So typically, the COO, CSO, or even the civil society organization, or even the community themselves, during the initial phase, will arrange an ad hoc response, to those non-gazetted centers. If we go into the sectoral response, so in terms of situation, as I mentioned earlier, so most homes are not destroyed. In most cases, anyway. So usually the number of relief centers is more than the number of affected population. So this year, I think the largest number of preparation made by the government, 8,000 over relief centers for 2.1 million people. I think 2020 was for 1.5. Then the year after about 1.7, 1.8, something like that. But so far, the number of flood evacuees has never reached up to 1 million. But then there is still gaps, especially in facilities for disabled or elderly, because most of these temporary shelters are schools, which is not made to become a shelter. Therefore, there is issues in terms of the facilities for elderly or even individuals, in that centers. As well as there are no facilities for bathing and so on. There is like toilets, in schools, but not really for the use of bathing and so on. Again, the non-gazetted relief centers are often overlooked. This is common year in and year out. It's the same issues. In terms of water, sanitation, and hygiene, water supplies in the evacuation center itself is not really an issue. It is being provided either by trucks or they have like existing supplies, because the piping networks rarely being affected, except in the rural areas, whereby in most or at least in most part of the rural areas, Selangor included, in part of Selangor rural areas in Hulu Langat, for example, they are still dependent on alternative water solutions, either from the river water or from the tube wells or underground water. and these alternative solutions are impacted by the floods. So, for example, if they are getting their waters from they are tapping directly from the river. So in 2021, the debris from the hills, basically destroyed all these pipelines at the river. So meaning they even lost the source of water they are getting from the river because the pipelines were not working anymore. So yeah, so these issues is not really a flood issues alone per se. It is a longer term development issues that needs to be looked into. In terms of food security, community kitchens very common practice in Malaysia. So government usually provide like teams as well as supplies, and in certain cases, I was made to understand in Penang, for example, they just buy from the local vendor who will prepare the food, and then the hot meals is being delivered to the evacuation centers. In the non-gazetted relief centers, again, there's an issue, but community, will come together. They will purchase their own supplies and then cook, in their own community kitchens. And then sometimes, if they are managed to get like a CSO to be involved, they will support. This is even before the assistance from the government arrive. For example, in 2021 in Selangor, it's the same issue. I think there were some areas in Klang, for example, that was ungazetted. So and then the flood happens on Saturday, if I'm not mistaken. I think it was only on Monday or on Tuesday when the government sat down to basically discuss and coordinate. They decided to mobilize the stockpiles to the non-gazetted centers as well. So I think after 2 or 3 days only they received the official supplies. In terms of healthcare, throughout my experience, is well managed because healthcare, even at normal times, if there is no disaster, it is well managed. It is decentralized. The federal government provided the resources and all, but decisions, activities, and all managed at the local level, at the district as well as state level. And then usually at the district, even state level, they would involve CSO. Therefore, when they involve CSO, they would be able to know where is the non-gazetted relief centers, and they are able to mobilize the teams from CSO as well as from the Ministry of Health to these centers to provide healthcare. So far, I mean, there's no issue in terms of healthcare. I mean, based on my experience, it's well managed. But of course, you don't really have like too many like serious cases or like trending cases in Malaysia during the flood. In terms of livelihood, of course, 2014, there were a lot of impact in the rural areas. Agriculture, livestock, trade, as well as tourism was impacted. 2021, the flood affected the urban areas, which means more loss, as well in terms of income as well as the activities, because of its proximity within the urban areas. But more importantly, some of these loss of livelihood activities is not really due to the flood impact per se. Some of it is due to displacement, health risks, as well as psychological distress, because they felt unsafe, that they are not able to return to work. So those are among the factors that impact the livelihood activities. So we can see in terms of short term, they are like civil servant, those works in the office who are able to return back to work. If they feel they are safe, their properties are safe, their children are safe, can go back to school. If not, it will take longer for them to go back to work. Small medium enterprises, especially medium-sized enterprise as well as transportation-based industry, just to give an example, will take like at least a month to be restored. Again, I mean, their recovery is faster compared to other activities because of the demand in terms of their services, which somehow accelerate the recovery process. There are certain sectors that is impacted longer, for example, agriculture, and then the smaller enterprises, the home-based bakery, and then the small workshops, because they would require external assistance, as well as there are other factors. For example, paddy field in Kedah was affected because the quality of water was affected as well by the flood. So they had to wait until the quality of water returned to normal in order for them to allow the replant of the paddy field. So in terms of response and coordination, is decentralized based on the Directive 20. Each state has the autonomy to initiate response effort. Even at each state, each district has the authority to activate the response effort. But we notice there is a lack of coherence in terms of communication between state and federal level. Of course, there is the political side of it as well, whereby some states are governed by the opposition instead of the federal government. So there is that as well impacting the coordination. Resource mobilization. Resources, unfortunately, is centralized. It's only mobilized a couple of months before the disaster itself. But I think more needs to be done to improve the contingency planning and resource mobilization to avoid unprecedented events. For example, in 2021, one of the reasons why there were some delays in responding to Selangor was because some of the, or maybe part of the assets was already mobilized to the East Coast, anticipating that the flood is going to hit the East Coast again. But I think the flood actually hit Selangor and Pahang mainly. But nevertheless, I mean, they managed to respond effectively. But there is lack of clarity in terms of community, responders. They have certain things that they can contribute, but cannot be acknowledged. There is also a consideration that needs to be made in terms of resources, other resources besides government resources, especially in urban response. For example, there are private assets, rescue teams that could be included in the planning as well. In terms of communication, I think since NADMA was the National Disaster Management Agency was established back in 2015, they had been very proactive in initiating and improving the communication between state, federal, and also all the agencies involved in the flood response. They even went to the extra mile to include the CSO as part of this. But because NADMA is not involved, or they are not like the leading agencies all the time, because flood in Malaysia has not been declared as a national emergency most of the time. So some of these efforts were not cascaded down. So they are only there to provide supporting role to provide the assets. So I think NADMA's role has not been tapped to the maximum or to the optimum level. And then there's the community participation. So there is a recognition where community can provide more to the response effort, but there is this the capacity that needs to be looked at. I mean, there is an effort from the civil defense to train and empower communities since 2022, but there is this lack of they call it in Malaysia punca kuasa, the source of authority to allow whether or not the community can respond. So at the end, if the community decided to respond, it has to be on a voluntary basis, meaning it cannot be based on instruction by this government agency or that government agency, because it's not stipulated in the Directive number 20. So just to go, I think, a couple more slides. Recovering from flood, government leads all the recovery efforts from the federal level. But I think there is a need to call for a multi-stakeholder approach, especially the challenges is in the data collection, data verification, as well as sharing. The general data in terms of government infrastructure or the infrastructure, road infrastructure, and all government can verify those information. But the community data, houses that has been destroyed or affected, major, or minor damage, that needs a lot of resources. To date, I think the government only relies on the head of the villages to verify this data. they has, I mean, they don't really have the the technical knowledge, to do this. So at the end, it causes like duplication, it causes like delay in getting the response, to the right people and so on. So I think there is a need to call for a multi-stakeholder approach as well as enhanced verification process.
Sorry,
In
Simon,
terms
can you wrap up, please? Thanks.
Sure, thank you. So I think I can wrap up with these two slides. In terms of preparedness, I think there is a need to call for a whole society approach, as well as looking into the total disaster risk management, because I think the role of the community needs to be really empowered when we talk about future responding to disasters. There is this long-term development issues that needs to be addressed as well, because at the end of the day, some of these development issues is actually is going to impact how Malaysia responds to the flood. For example, the schools that is being used as a temporary relief centers needs to be looked if they are being upgraded, whether or not they are going to include the aspect of them becoming a relief centers. Health centers, every year we see like health centers had to be closed even after the flood has ended for 2 or 3 months because it has been affected. So I think government needs to look if there are new health centers, how can they approach to improve the planning. So it is not a short-term solution, it needs to have like a longer term solution. So yeah, I think that's all. I think I have covered all the things that I wanted to say. Community to be involved, comprehensive multi-stakeholder involvement, as well as the longer term over short term responses. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. I think you've raised a number of issues that we hear often over the challenge between longer term development and the humanitarian responses that we see, and whether or not there is some intersection and lessons learned between the two. Can I now turn to Kian-Ming, please, for your presentation?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Al. Thanks for the invitation. I don't have slides, and I'll be sharing a couple of points based on my experience as a former member of parliament who worries about flooding issues in his constituency every time it rains, and also as somebody who has been involved in relief and rescue efforts during the flooding in the East Coast in 2014, very serious in the 3 states of Pahang, Kelantan, and Terengganu, and also more recently in 2021 in the Klang Valley, when a confluence of factors made the flooding situation very, very serious. I think before we go into my points, I think we need to make clear that there are probably 3 major sources of flooding that we're talking about. Firstly, the most obvious one comes from direct rainfall. And obviously, when this becomes heavy in areas where the drainage is not good, you'll see water overflow, whether it's in the urban or the rural areas. And then the second source of flooding comes from river overflow, when the rain is so heavy that the rivers will overflow its banks and cause the adjoining areas to flood. And then thirdly, probably less common, would be the situation whereby tidal flows, where, for example, high tide in the Straits of Malacca or along the East Coast coincides with heavy rainfall, whereby the rivers are not able to flow properly into the Straits of Malacca or on the East Coast, into the South China Sea, and then there's a lot of backflow which happens, which then contributes to serious flooding. And this was the situation that took place in the Klang Valley at the end of 2021. So I think these things need to be highlighted. I'll come back to the issue of river overflow later when I talk about riverbank development. So the first point I'd like to make is that there are long-term development expenditure allocations that the government provides for, especially at the federal level, for infrastructure improvements that will mitigate some of the worst problems associated with flooding. This is especially important with respect to river overflows as a source of flooding, I'm talking about building bunds, building better sort of like systems whereby water pumps can be used to pump back water that's spilled from the river back into the river. So these are long-term infra improvements that are planned by the government on a regular basis. I think the challenge here is that we do not have any reporting structure with regards to where this money is being spent, and also more importantly, whether they are effective in decreasing the incidence of flooding when there is heavy rainfall. So this is something that is part and parcel of budget tracking or the lack thereof in terms of tracking how money is being spent and whether it's effective or not. So I'll give a very simple example. I think Hafiz talked about warning systems on riverbanks. Part and parcel of that long-term development expenditure does go to river warning systems, but sometimes these systems, when they're not maintained properly, they actually fall out of repair and go into disrepair. And this was exactly what happened along the banks of Sungai Langat in December 2021 when there was a serious flooding. Basically, the residents couldn't be warned because the flood warning system did not function properly. So these are some of the first point is to do with long-term development expenditure and how we need proper monitoring to see how it does or does not fulfill its objectives. The second thing I want to make is point I want to make is there are also short-term measures such as trying to improve drainage, for example. This is mostly under the jurisdiction of the local councils rather than the federal or the state governments. And I think this can mitigate some of the flash floods, but it definitely will not be able to mitigate some of the more serious flooding from things like the rivers overflowing its banks. So short term is more like a salve, but the long term measures are the ones that are more important. I think the third point I'd like to make is with regards to emergency preparedness and also warning systems. I think we have some of those systems already in place, especially post-disaster. And I think Hafiz Syed has talked about that just now. But I'd like to say that some of the warning systems can actually be improved. So we have a Met department that carries out weather forecasts and the like. And in some states like Selangor, there's actually a lot of money that's been spent on this kind of smart weather tracking systems. But what happens in reality is that the information that is gathered by these agencies does not get communicated to the people on the ground. And if you think about it, in this day and age where you have phone apps and other sort of alert systems, it's actually very easy to alert people. But this has not really been embedded into the ecosystem. And I think this means that people are not prepared when flash flood happens. And also like to bring up something that maybe the others haven't talked about. One of the sources of flooding with regards to rivers is when the dams that retain water, when during heavy rainfalls, the authorities which control the dams, they need to release the water from the dams. And when the water is released from the dams, usually there's no warning system. And the challenge with this issue is because if, let's say, there is a warning system whereby the authorities actually do warn people that water is going to be released from the dam at very heavy sort of like volume, what may happen is that the people who are affected by this may use this information to then later on sue the federal or the state governments, the people that are in charge of the dams, right? So we have this quandary whereby, we need to have a proper warning system, but the authorities are afraid that this warning system may be used to for legal means to take the government to courts for compensation and things of that nature. Yeah, and then the fourth point I'd like to make is, there's also the issue of development that has been discussed, but a lot of this, we haven't really discussed the problems of upstream development, whereby upstream development, when there's a lot more housing, demands, when there's a lot more forests that have been cleared, usually what will happen is that there's a lot of silting downstream, and then this causes, of course, faster water flow along the rivers, and shallower rivers, which means that it takes less rain for river overflows to happen. So this is something that I think needs coordinated effort by the local, state, and also federal governments in order to tackle. The next point I'd like to make is the usage of technology in terms of being able to use technology and tracking systems to measure areas that are affected by floods. So I think Syed mentioned just now, sometimes these floods are still being the information gathering system is still at a very primitive level, using sources from the village heads and whatnot. But in some of the urban areas where measurements by the meteorological department is better, where the measurements and reporting structure by the drainage and irrigation department is better. Some private companies, including Urban Metri, for example, they've actually developed an online system whereby you can have a flood tracking report, where you can check the prevalence of floods among certain properties in different areas. This will be mostly in the urban area. So there are ways in which you can check on this. I think technology would be one way in which we can improve information access to people. That being said, even if, let's say, you have better information sharing, I think the challenge here is that if, let's say, in a place like Taman Sri Muda that was very badly affected in the December 2021 floods, it may not be so easy for you to ask people to move out of those areas, right? Because this is a relatively low income area. People may not have that many alternatives. And then you also have to remember that these people are living in ecosystems where there are jobs close by, where they have perhaps, jobs that are in the factories nearby, in the hawker centers nearby and whatnot. And their kids go to schools that are nearby, their families also live nearby. So it may not be so easy for these families to just relocate. Maybe one couple of other points I want to make, last 2 points would be with regards to river bank rehabilitation. I think this is something that's quite important because there are many river banks that are populated by buildings illegally. There's supposed to be a clearing of 20 meters on each side that belongs to the authorities. But because of overbuilding and sometimes illegal buildings, this makes the riverbanks not so easily accessible in terms of trying to build bunds and things of that nature. So the local government also has a role to play in terms of trying to clear up some of these riverbanks so that proper infrastructure can be built. And then maybe the last point, I think we need to be creative in coming up with certain solutions with regards to flood mitigation. And I think the River of Life project in KL is one good example, whereby the idea is good in terms of being able to clean up and clear the river, including the riverbank, so that tourism activities can be undertaken. And once this happens, once people can see that the rivers can actually be made use of for recreation activities, there will be much more care and also resources being paid to the health of the river, to overdevelopment upstream, to the dumping of rubbish into the rivers. And this can be part and parcel of a longer term project whereby river rehabilitation can lead to tourism activities. And then this can also be partly funded by sustainable development that happens along the rivers, so that money made from these developments can be plowed back into the river rehabilitation and upkeep. So that's part and parcel of where I think creativity in terms of government policy is coming. I'll stop there and then back to Alistair. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Kian-Ming. Okay, before I hand over to Ariel, I just want to raise a couple of points which really struck me in the presentations. I mean, from Fiona, when you were presenting, what struck me was the number of phrases from the historical case that we hear again today, that actually pretty much everything you said then we witness right now in the issues that we have with flood management. So I'm just wondering, in the historical case that you shared, what was really that catalyst that created the change in a nutshell? Was there the pressure from society on those officials, or what was some of those significant catalysts there, other than the ones you mentioned in your presentation? I'm just thinking about more of the politics of the time component of it. For Said, I'm just wondering, with your presentation on the humanitarian dynamics that we've seen, and it's pretty much a functioning humanitarian system that we see in Malaysia. It's good. It responds when we have floods in Malaysia. So what is it that the humanitarian system is doing that can be shared with the governance with longer term implications? Like, if we're so good at doing it in a reactive measure, what is it that can be given to some of these longer term challenges to so we don't have to be doing that? And then for Kian-Ming, I think all your points here were really well received, and I'm just wondering, like, in your experience, what is the reason for all these concerns when we look at flood management not taking a place in perhaps people's choices, or what is its role in the politics of Malaysia? Why doesn't it get more airtime, or why isn't it taking on a stronger role when we're looking at elections, given that it is affecting so many people in Malaysia? Why is it that they're not asking that of the politicians, or asking those questions in elections? Perhaps you've got some insights with that. Before I turn back to the panelists, I think I'll just hand over to Ariel now, while you perhaps think about those questions, and then Ariel can add some questions and we can go from there. Ariel?
Thank you, Al. I thought all your presentations were really interesting, and I also had some questions for the speakers. So I don't know if we should let them do the first round, responding to your questions first.
Okay, sure. Fiona, we'll go back in the order that they spoke.
Sure. Great. I'll forget otherwise if we carry on. So thanks for that question. And I think you're absolutely right. And it never ceases to amaze me, you know, the things that both Kian-Ming and Said were both saying. These are all things that have come up in all the historical case studies I've looked at as well. And you know, these things just literally repeat themselves. But you asked me specifically about some of the other catalysts for, you know, why did the British government at that time respond to this event? I mean, there've been loads of floods, you know, throughout the entire British administration, you know, from kind of the very early 1800s. But why did it take until kind of the 1920s to really start investing in a lot more in infrastructure and departmental solutions as well, sanitary boards, drainage and irrigation departments, and all these things? Well, the answer to that is actually quite manifold, and I'll try not to give you a long historian's answer. But essentially, there was a lot of changing role of government at that time, partly linked to the changing expectations of government, what government should provide. In kind of the 18th and 19th century, government was expected just to do foreign policy, military, that kind of stuff, provide loans for the monarch. But that role changes over time. By the early 20th century, you've got a situation where government is expected to also look after the people in a very different way. And a lot of this comes out of social reform movements of the 19th century. So there's this changing expectations of what government should do and what they should provide. Ideas of social reform that are coming in from the late 19th century as well. And within the colonial context as well, by the 1920s, you've got a much tighter government administration. In the 19th century, things were very much ad hoc. I mean, Malaysia was still being governed by the East India Company until 1867, which were just a corporation. They were not a government. So a lot of things changed by the 1920s. But you've also got a massively big, much bigger population as well. There's a rising culture of complaint, and I've looked through the newspapers at the time as well to actually look at kind of how public responses to these events change over time. And there is much more of a culture of complaint by the 1920s, along with this rising population. And with the rising population, you need more other things as well, like infrastructures and in other things to manage with these larger populations. And the early 1900s, the population of especially the towns at Kuala Lumpur and Singapore especially increase a lot. So government has to kind of step up.
Great, thank you. Said?
Okay, so in terms of the longer term solutions on how this effort can be seen as or can be taken as more proactive rather than reactive. I think the response at the initial phase itself will be reactive because in any type of response, I mean, of course, the disaster needs to happen for you to respond. So it will continue to become reactive. However, the things or the activities, the effort that is being done before the actual response or before the actual disaster itself, that needs to be improve, or that needs to be more emphasized. Community preparedness as one example. There is already efforts because I've seen in the case of the civil defense, they do have this module to train the communities. Before this, it was mainly focused on the rescue. The training was focusing on rescue. But since 2022, last year, I've seen that they have improved the module. It's now on the community-based disaster risk management, meaning the community is being prepared to like plan before the disaster, to have their own committee, and then so this is steps that is being taken in order to prepare for the community to be proactive. So when there is a disaster happening, so at least they don't really have to wait for the government to intervene. Only then they start the rescue effort, or even assisting the communities, but the community themselves can be empowered to begin the rescue effort as well as assisting their communities. I think just to give an example, I mean, in Japan, when we responded to some of the crises there, I know some of the Malaysian or the government agencies in Malaysia wouldn't like for us to give example in Japan, but we've seen how this works, how the community basically reacts, and then they basically takes the lead when it comes to response. They manage the evacuation centers. They provided, they manage the evacuation centers. They collect the data of the communities at the evacuation centers, and then they are the one who is going to inform the government what they need for the evacuation centers, so that the government will only provide, based on what is requested by the community. So that is how it should be done. So that there is no wastages. Even the communities are being responsible. They just ask what they really need, because they already have some preparation even beforehand. So I don't know if this is can be done in Malaysia. Maybe it can, but it will need like more time, and then needs more effort from both the communities as well as the government and the other parties to make this happen.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, to answer Al's question on the political dimension of this, I would say the following. Firstly, I think the government and governments in the past have been responsive in the sense that there has been allocation of development funding, like I said, but the challenge becomes measurement and impact of impact. That's one. Second response is that like what Syed said, whenever the floods happen, then there's a lot of attention being paid at that particular point in time. And then once the flood is over, once the disaster relief has been undertaken, then people forget, right? So once people forget, then the political pressure to actually do something, especially for some of the longer term mitigation measures, the pressure also lets up. And that's why I think sometimes the voters let the government off the hook, so to speak. And I think the third point would be that because flooding is such a complicated issue involving different factors, that sometimes the public doesn't really know what they expect the government to do except to solve it. And because there are sometimes short medium as well as long-term solutions that can be put on the table. The policy approach towards solving these problems become more complicated and hence makes it difficult for accountability purposes, especially during elections time. And fourthly, in a constituency like mine, that had 300,000 voters, in reality, the people who are affected by the floods actually is a very small percentage. So even if, let's say, I let's say couldn't solve those problems immediately, but if let's say I show that I'm trying to solve those problems, that may be enough to mitigate the political pressure, and I depend on the votes of all the other people who vote on other factors besides flooding. Right. So maybe just one last point. I don't think we've really talked about this in detail. I think the policy landscape is further complicated by issues of climate change. So once we bring that into the picture, then it becomes even more complicated because then the government will be able to say these are big climate change issues. We can't really solve it even from the perspective of development expenditure, and we have to go to arenas such as COP28 and COP to be able to try to resolve these things.
Great, thanks. Ariel, over to you.
Thank you, Al. So my question for Dr. Williamson was there the presence of traditional society that is that was led by the royal houses? Did you see how they were involved in responding to the floods, apart from the overlay of the colonial government? How did that play at the time? If there was any evidence of a sense of responsibility, from the traditional feudal system in Malaya. Related to that is, did you see a difference in response in terms of the straight settlements and the federated and unfederated? This is kind of related to, I suppose, my interest in the role of the royal houses and traditional leadership, whether or not the people look to them. So for Mr. Syed, I'm very curious to learn from you as to what are the flood victims' perception of who is responsible, or is it federal government, state government? Did they think that the community should do more? Secondly, the vulnerable groups. Did you the people like the orang asli? Sometimes you hear references to how it's hard to reach them, hard to bring help to them. So I was wondering whether or not you saw that. Thirdly, is the role of political parties. So I thought that was interesting. Connected to my question as to whether or not people are resigned, right? Because this is a kind of regular affair. There's infrastructure, there's money allocated every year for such an occurrence. So it seems to be taken for granted that the floods will happen. We're going to be moved to some place and wait it out. So are people just resigned? And if on the part of political parties, do they see this as an opportunity to say, this is when I give out help, and you would need to depend on me, whether or not I'm a political party or if I'm the state or federal government? Is there that sense of dependency? So resignation plus dependency leading to an annual kind of event, right? So that's for you. And thirdly, I guess for Prof. Ong, I was also interested in whether or not there was thought of deploying armed forces, right? So was there any, what could you share with us some of the thinking behind deploying uniformed armed forces, which I think they did get involved in 2021? What were the kind of complications? And also, I guess related to Al's question also, what do you think are the sort of pressures that can be applied so that some of the problems that you highlight, can be attended to? Because what you're saying is that the issues are long-term, are complicated. People who need help are really quite stressed at that time, and then after that, people just get on with their lives. So normally there are NGOs, for instance, like Verse and groups like that, who are kind of persistently there, pressing issues long term, right? Whereas, I guess that doesn't quite happen with floods. So, whether or not that could help lead to solutions that you're talking about, because without pressure, that's probably hard to see happening. Thank you.
Thanks, Ariel. Maybe let's go to Fiona first.
Okay. Okay. So yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I would say that I haven't particularly looked into disaster responses from the Malay Sultanate, because I suppose largely because I've been mainly focusing on the Straits settlements rather than the FMS and the un-FMS. So my focus has been more urban than rural. And what I would say is I haven't seen any evidence of it in Malaysia. But that's not to say it didn't exist. It's just the types of documents that I was looking at were British government documents. So we're talking about, military deployment, Salvation Army, hospitals, relief centers, all this kind of, standard kind of flood response that was happening across the early 20th century. But what I have found I did a much more detailed study of a flood that happened in 1954. Actually, this was in Singapore, although it did affect Malaysia as well. And from this, what you'll find is that communities have their own support systems. The Chinese communities, for example, look to the clan associations rather than to governments to help them. And the clan associations were actually extremely good in providing money and charitable relief for these, and actually getting charitable funds sorted out for this flood in 1954. And a lot of the communities tended to operate within their own community networks as well, rather than necessarily asking the government for help, although the government would be going around and providing a lot of these kind of overarching things. And I suppose this perhaps leads into your next question about kind of differences. And because I've been mainly looking at the Straits settlements, this is partly why I don't necessarily know the full answer to the first question. And so the government response tended to be more about protecting the towns and the urban areas. When they're talking about relief and they're talking about infrastructure, they tended to be talking about KL, Ipoh, Singapore. They were not necessarily talking about the small towns, the agricultural areas, beyond just providing immediate flood response relief. And where infrastructure was, where they're talking about like changing water courses and rivers and things like this, and looking into kind of structural solutions around these, but they were often where plantations were involved. So if there were big plantations that, providing money for, the economy, they were perhaps more concerned with dealing with these areas than perhaps just some of the smaller rural parts of the country.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Said.
Yep. Thank you for the question. So I think in terms of who is seen responsible from the community perspective, I think based on my observation, I don't think the community differentiate unless they are staying in a position states, then they would differentiate. Otherwise, the communities wouldn't differentiate whether the assistance should be coming from the federal government or from the state government. But somehow it has to do with this. I'm just using this term, subsidized mentality, whereby they expect that everything is going to be provided by the government. So because somehow most of the thing is being subsidized by the government anyway. So because of this, even for things like in terms of relief effort, I mean, they have this in their mind. That's why it created this wait and see situation, because they think that the government will come and provide the assistance. Of course, the government has that responsibility, but I think if that is the way that you think, when responding to a disaster, I think it may be too late, to a certain extent. So that's number one. In terms of assistance for the orang asli, of course, even the government, they have like an agency that manages orang asli, and then among CSO, there are CSO or NGOs who have like a niche in supporting orang asli in Malaysia. So even in a flood response, I mean, they are not neglected. Maybe in some cases there is some delay because where they are staying, even if there is no flood, it will take like 1 to 2 days for you to reach to certain areas in Gua Musang, for example, because of the road condition. So you can imagine, if there is a flood, it will take much longer. So, but nevertheless, I mean, the orang asli community, they are much more resilient. So they are able to manage. And then again, I mean, they are orang asli, and then in a way they are nomadic community. So they are able to in a way they are more resilient compared to the rest of the community. But there are efforts from the government, there are agencies from the government as well as from the CSO who is providing assistance to the orang asli. Time-wise, I mean, I would say there is maybe depending on the locations and all. In terms of the political party role, of course, I mean, there is pro and cons, I would say. What is the pro? I think it will expedite some of the processes. If there is an involvement or a push from the political politician from that area saying that their area needs this assistance or that assistance, there is because it works. Usually it works. They can push. They can they can like have their voices heard, and then the federal government will provide assistance to those areas. So I think in that sense, the political party or the politician itself, I mean, they have, I mean, it's good for them to be involved in a response effort. The cons, I've been to places or states whereby, for example, in Kelantan or even in Terengganu, there is two lists of communities. From the same kampung, you have two lists because you have two community leaders in the same kampung or the same village. One community leader is appointed by the state. One community leader is appointed by the federal. So you have to get both lists in order for you to cross-check, whether the names are the same. So that when you are providing the assistance, you are not missing out on anyone. I'm talking on behalf of of the NGO or CSO, because I'm not sure how it is being done. If the political party or the politicians providing assistance, most probably they are only going to like just one side of the community or those who are supporting them. So I think that is the cons, because when you talk about response, I think it has to be blanket. It has to be overall. You cannot really choose who you want to assist, or because as long as there is a need, for that community, regardless of their political party, religion, and so on. I mean, it has to be provided. I've seen this before. I mean, but recently maybe it's much lesser. In Selangor, I've not seen it, but yeah, I mean, I've experienced this before. And then sometimes even the NGOs, they are affected because when you go to like certain places in Terengganu, you come from an NGO, you are a neutral body, but then they will ask you from which party, or which party are you representing? So they ask you that kind of question. So you see, I mean, there is pro and cons when we talk about how politicians are being seen and their role in responding. So yeah, I mean, that's good, and that's something that may impact how response is being done. Yeah.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, I just add on a little bit to that and also to answer Ariel's questions. I think where there is greater political competition, the responses of the political parties will also be enhanced. So, for example, in the floods in Selangor in 2021, because we knew that elections were going to be happening soon, the federal government gave 1,000 ringgit to all of the people affected by the floods, and then the Selangor state government also gave 1,000 ringgit. So the politicians were there, competing against one another to give out this money to the affected people. But in reality, the politics of flooding in Malaysia and probably I can say in many other places as well, on the whole, in general, it's not a very politically salient issue. For some of the reasons already explained earlier, and also because perhaps in many of the cases, the politicians have come and gone, but the flooding issues remain. So basically, the people that are affected have given up on politicians and also on the government already. They are resigned to the fact that this will happen, regardless of who is in power. I think this is quite sad, but in situations where I've seen funding does go down to the ground and it's properly spent, it can make a difference. So, for example, in the town of Kajang, which experienced quite serious flooding after, in between 2013 to 2018, after Wan Aziza became the state representative there, there was more pressure for the Menteri Besar at the point in time, Azmin Ali, to try to solve these problems, and he allocated quite a bit of funding to deepen the rivers, to improve the infrastructure around Kajang town, and now the flooding in Kajang town has basically stopped already. Right, so I think there are areas where definitely good funding and proper monitoring can make a difference, but these are probably few and far in between from what I've experienced and seen, and that's why I think a lot of people are a little bit jaded in terms of what politicians can or cannot do.
Thank you.
Thank you all for your responses. We've got 3 questions just from the audience, and I hope you can indulge us just to run over a little bit of time so we get a chance to share those questions with you. And I'll go around to each of the panelists. And if you've got any final comments, then please put that at the end of the response to the question. So we have one question to Fiona, which is, was there any mention or hint in any of the archives that development in these years were constructed in floodplains, wetlands, flood hazard areas? Then to Said, you mentioned about the wait and see attitude, basically in the urban disaster areas. And what do you think that NADMA can do to socialize the people in those areas to move away from the wait and see approach, to have them be more proactive, like you mentioned in the rural areas? And then the final question is one to everybody. So, we've got 2, sorry, here now. So one is, if somebody would like to answer the question about a whole of society approach has been mentioned a few times. Can you assess how well it has been implemented in Malaysia, and if there are any challenges to a whole of society approach and what it means in the Malaysian context? And then our last question here is, what is the role international partners, whether it be countries, transnational organizations, etc., in flood prevention and flood relief can do beyond monetary donations? So I guess that's asking a bit more about expertise, or what other activities do we see them playing in Malaysia? And I'll just go back through the order in which you spoke. So Fiona, if you could answer the question, and then any final comments.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the British colonial settlements in particular really bucked the trend. Traditional housing, traditional communities, traditional kampong were often built with nature in mind. But the colonial settlements were built in areas of strategic importance for the British Empire. So they were areas that would be ports. So they were thinking more about the harbour and the depth of the harbour, rather than necessarily the suitability of the immediate area. So, I mean, Singapore is a classic example. It's low-lying. Most of the coastal area is prone to tidal flooding. There's riverine flooding. A large part of the indigenous landscape is also marshland, mangrove swamp. So it's really not the best place to actually to have built a settlement. KL, in many respects, is the same, built around the Klang River in the valley, the floodplain. So in order to develop these areas, you actually have to go against nature. And try and constrain nature from doing what it actually needs to do, from, say, riverine or tidal flooding. So I would actually argue that a lot of the problems we have today in urban areas are actually grounded in some of these historical settlement patterns, and the development of towns and cities in what were essentially unsuitable places.
Thank you. Said?
Sure. So, with regards to the wait and see situation, so how can NADMA, in a way, address this? I think there has already been effort by NADMA through the civil defense, as I mentioned earlier, through the programs that they are doing. But there are still gaps, I would say, in terms of, because they just had this launch like last year. There is gaps in terms of resources, financially, being put into this. Even if they have enough resources in terms of financial, the expertise in NADMA itself, whether they have enough expertise to train all the communities, I mean, that is staying in a flood-prone area. So that's why I think maybe just to go into the whole society approach as well, there needs to be an effort to include the civil society, as well as some of the corporate entities to be part of this as a whole, not as a piecemeal, or not just to appoint them as a third party or consultant to do this, but to be included as as a whole in the long-term planning, for them to be involved in the training of the communities, yeah, so the resources can be shared. Because it's not only just about the training. The training is one thing. When you do, when you socialize this knowledge to the communities, it needs to be monitored as well. So I don't think the civil defense have the capacity to monitor all the communities. So it has to be done through like certain other ways, maybe through the civil society, or even if they are like certain monitoring system that can be included, maybe by the private sector, or even the universities, to monitor if some of these activities are being implemented at the community level, and then see how is it being effective, or if there are any things that can be improved. So this is where the whole society approach that can be implemented. Again, I mean, the thing is, I mean, it is happening, but it is in a piecemeal manner. So it's not comprehensive. So I think this is where the strategy needs to be looked back and then improve. As long as it is done on a piecemeal basis, as long as NGO needs to submit proposal, for them to ask funding to conduct a CBDRM program, I think it will not work. So I think there needs to be like a more comprehensive system of including them, and then making sure that all the things or the knowledge that is being socialized in terms of the community-based disaster risk management or other things is being standardized as well. It cannot be like you have this organization teaching this module, but you have other organization doing the same training, but having like a different module. So there's a lot of things, a lot of components to it. That's why it needs to be done in a very comprehensive manner. Thanks.
Thank you. And Kian-Ming?
Yeah, just a couple of final thoughts. I think I would be happy with not a whole of society approach, but a whole of government approach in terms of doing flood mitigation. I think Malaysia does pretty well in terms of coordination from a flood relief standpoint, but we don't do so well from a flood prevention or flood mitigation standpoint. So this requires the different ministries, the Department of the Environment, the Department of Drainage and Irrigation, the also local authorities that gives approvals for developments, especially those that are near the river areas, and then federal government when it comes to other larger policies, and then state governments when it comes to coordinating some of these things like dumping rubbish into the rivers and things like and also drains and things like that. So if let's say we can get that together, I think that would be a very good first step. On the question of role of international partners in flood prevention and flood relief, I think because in Malaysia, the internal capacity for flood relief perspective, like I said, is still pretty okay. You don't really see international organizations coming in. Even in the serious floods that took place in Klang Valley in December 2021, the international organization, so to speak, that was quite active in cleaning up was but that was comprised of mostly of Malaysians. even though that organization hails from Taiwan. So yeah, I think Malaysia maybe doesn't really need international partners in terms of these areas, but we can actually do better from an internal coordination standpoint. Thank you.
Thanks. Kian-Ming, can I just follow up on that one? I mean, there was a recent announcement with the role of the Netherlands in supporting the government in Malaysia with their mitigation measures. So I'm just wondering if what sort of role do you see for those kind of partnerships?
Yeah, I think from a technical perspective, this is where Netherlands help and assistance can come in, especially sharing with us some of their more innovative development expenditure for things like being able to store water in certain areas, certain low-lying areas. But we have to wait to see the details of this, because as you know, when prime ministers meet, there's a lot of fanfare, but it's actually the follow-up that's much more important. But I would say that the Netherlands has contributed in a different way. I'm not sure whether you read the news about how Coldplay actually sponsored a couple of these floating machines that goes around the rivers to clean up the river debris and rubbish, right? So I think that's one thing that is nice to have in terms of this kind of support to clean up the rivers. But like I said, to make it sustainable, we actually need to have our own homegrown efforts. Maybe we can use foreign technology, but ultimately it's a problem that Malaysians have to solve ourselves.
Great, thank you. Well, that just leaves me to thank the speakers, to thank Ariel for her discussion questions and reflections, to thank the participants for being here, and to thank those behind the scenes for making this all happen. So thank you to everyone, and we hope to see you again at a future RSIS event.